Hi, everybody. Hope you're having a good weekend. That's when I'm making these recordings. So, or had a good weekend by the time you watch these recordings. We're starting week 3 and going to talk about prey location in barn owls and how owls use spatial auditory maps and coincidence detection again for sound localization, and then introduce some new stuff with neuroplasticity. And we're going to use 3 different videos to do this. So the first one will be, like before, the problem of a visual nocturnal hunter that doesn't echolocate. And then how people in general, or historically at least, have studied acoustic maps in owls. They've become a really great system for understanding sound localization and for understanding plasticity. And then we'll move on to video 2, where we'll talk about some of the mechanisms, and some of this will be familiar to you: coincidence detection and delay lines, and then complex receptive fields and lateral inhibition, which will be a new concept. And then in video 3, we're going to move into some neuroplasticity. And just as a side note, there's a few pictures that weirdly are blocking some text, but I went through the presentation. It's not too bad, so I'm not gonna mess around with trying to fix it right now. So we'll start with owl foraging, and I've got this video for you guys.
This is the great horned owl's time. He's one of the largest and most powerful owl species in America. As dusk turns to dark, he looks down into a forest clearing. His eyes are tuned for optimal night vision. But more importantly, he listens. His ear-like horns are simply tufts of feathers. No one knows for sure what they're for, but they have nothing to do with hearing. His real ears are hidden under his head feathers. They're positioned asymmetrically. The right one is slightly higher than the left one. Sound reaches one ear a fraction of a second later than the other. That gives him incredible accuracy, pinpointing the source. A faint rustling in the dead leaves. It's another nighttime hunter, a deer mouse. He's patrolling the leaf litter, looking for bugs and seeds. The owl hasn't quite keyed in on the sound, but a turn of the head changes that. Its head spins a full 270 degrees, 3/4 of a full rotation. His ears tell his light-sensitive eyes exactly where to look. His 2 main senses are in sync. Target locked. Now, the owl unleashes another secret weapon. Fringed wing feathers that muffle any flapping sound. It's a double advantage. The owl can still hear its prey while flying, and the mouse doesn't have a clue what's coming. And probably never knew what hit him.
Okay. So why use owls for studying sound localization? And, largely has to do with this natural history of theirs, being nocturnal hunters, but not having evolved echolocation, that has driven this evolution of very precise sound localization, so that when they hear a sound at night, they can't see very far, certainly, this very precise sound localization allows them to turn their head to the exact point where their eyes will be on the target, on the sound, whatever's making that sound. And that's been a behavior that has allowed researchers to study how sound and visual cues map onto each other and what happens when those get altered. So that's why they're also then a good model for studying neuroplasticity, because the sound and the visual processing centers communicate very closely. Any changes to visual or auditory perception can cause a misalignment between those two systems. And what we've learned, and what some researchers have really investigated heavily, is that neuroplasticity can help to compensate, at least in some cases, and realign those systems together. And so that'll be the third video that we talk about, or that we in this week. So first we'll start with how originally it was Masakazu Konishi who did a lot of these experiments, and really, became famous for his work with barn owls. And one of the ways that they tested how owls orient their head to look at a particular sound coming in space was a pretty simple and brilliant, which is what many of these kind of older experiments were like, set up, where they had a speaker, a target speaker, which would make, like, say, the rustling sound of a mouse. And that would that was movable in essentially 360-degree space. So you can see the red colored sliding bar that the speaker could slide along, and that could be rotated up and down, so you could change the elevation of the sound, and then you could move the speaker around to change the azimuth of the sound. And then at the same time, the owl is on a perch, and they've mounted a magnet on the top of the owl's head, and it's sitting inside of a magnetic coil. And so anytime that the bird moves, it induces a change in the magnetic field that is measurable, and that it's so specific that they can get really detailed descriptions of how the owl moves in regards to the location of the speaker. So this was used in order to study the behavioral aspects, but then what they could do is start to do manipulations of the owl's neurons, and then test how that impacted their visual orientation to an acoustic signal. Owls are built for sound localization, so their probably most diagnostic characteristic is this kind of dish-faced shape. Dish-shaped face. Wow, that's a tongue twister. And then this kind of the facial ruff, which is the circle of really stiff feathers around the outside of the face. And those feathers are essentially, their structure allows sound to move along them really well, and they channel it right down into the ear. And the ears are asymmetrical. So this picture of the skull, you can see really well the ears are quite large, first of all, the openings relative to the size of the skull. And second of all, the right ear, and remember when we say right and left, we're referring to the owl's right and left, not what we're seeing on the picture here. So the right ear is pointed slightly up, and the left ear is pointed slightly down. And we're going to see that allows for sound localization. So if you think about an owl in space, we've talked about these terms already. Elevation is essentially the sound up or down relative to the bird's head, and azimuth is left to right. And similar to the bat, they use similar cues in order to locate sounds in that space. So for elevation, if a sound occurs above the owl, they're going to hear it louder. So it's going to be a level or a intensity difference in the right ear compared to the left. And that's because of that asymmetrical positioning where the opening is up on the right and down on the left. And so it's louder in the ear that's pointed towards the sound. And so sounds above the animal are going to register as being louder. So you might have more action potentials from hair cells in the right ear compared to hair cells in the left ear. And then if a sound originates from below the bird, then it's going to be louder in the left ear than the right ear. So you get information about elevation through the interoral level difference, or in other words, the interoral amplitude difference or loudness difference. For azimuth, if the sound originates to the right side of the bird, then it's going to arrive faster in the right ear. This was the same for bats in terms of locating azimuth positioning. And it's also going to be louder in the right ear. And then if you have a left ear sound or a sound from the left, it's going to arrive faster in the left ear and be louder in the left ear. And so what we see for azimuth is that you have that interoral timing difference, ITD, but you also have perhaps contributing a little bit to a lesser degree, the interoral level difference, this loudness difference. And you can see that experimentally. So this was, I think, Eric Knudsen, I believe, did this experiment where they took owls and then plugged one ear or the other with either a soft plug that attenuated some of the sound or a hard plug that attenuated even more sound. And then they asked the owl to locate sounds played in space using that system. And what they found is that if you plugged an ear, I'm gonna, hang on one second, sorry, distracted by my drawing things here. There we go, that's what I wanted. Okay, so if you plug the right ear, then the owl thinks the sound is actually coming from lower than it actually is. And that's, the right ear is oriented up. So if you plug it, then it seems like the sound isn't as loud from up high. And so it seems like the sound is coming from lower. And that's where you get these responses here. So this is the right ear is plugged, and therefore it's muted from above. And so the owl orients in a way that suggests that the sound is lower than it actually is. So you have the target there at 0 degrees, and the owl's looking lower. It thinks that the target is lower because that right ear is plugged. And if it's plugged with a soft plug, then the response is not quite as intense as if it's plugged with a hard plug. So that allowed them to confidently suggest that it was the interoral level difference that was allowing them to locate space, locate the elevation of the target. You can also see that that if you plug the right ear, then the owl thinks that the target is a little bit more left than it is. So the azimuth, this direction, is also shifted, and it's shifted in the opposite direction when you plug the other ear. Okay, so that's the intro story for prey location in barn owls. And now we're going to move into the neural pathways and talk about interoral timing differences.